In 2012, Goa Foundation filed a public interest litigation in the Supreme Court of India. It asked for a permanent ban of iron ore mining because there were a variety of illegalities which were documented by the Shah Commission of Inquiry, and the iron ore mining was happening in a global biodiversity hotspot, the Western Ghats. The state government, in turn, told the Supreme Court that there were a large segment of the population who were dependent on mining, and if there were a permanent ban, then there would be riots and the blood would be on the heads of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court turned around and said that we have ruled that the intergenerational equity principle is part of the right to life. But how do we implement intergenerational equity? We were really a little puzzled. So we decided to look and see what the academic theory says, as well as what is considered global best practice. Now it turns out intergenerational equity is a fairly straightforward principle. We must make sure that our children and future generations inherit at least as much as we did. So how do we do this? Imagine you inherit a piece of gold jewelry. Now you can decide to keep the gold as is, but it then becomes a headache. So you put it into a bank locker and now it becomes an expense. So you decide to sell the jewelry, buy a small piece of land. You get the income from the land today. Your child inherits the land and they get the income in their turn. Now in Goa, under the constitution, the minerals are owned by the state. So the responsibility to achieve intergenerational equity falls on the state. We use the financial accounts of Goa's largest extractor, then Sesa Goa, today it's called Vedanta, and the budgets of the state government. And here's what we found over an 8-year period from 2004 to 2012. For every 170 rupees of mineral ore that was extracted and sold, the total expenses was 60. We also provided for a very generous 20% after-tax return on assets for the extractor because they're in business, and that works out to another 10. So the total cost of extraction and sale of the mineral was 70. It was worth 170, so the balance 100 was the value of the mineral before it had been extracted, the value of the mineral for the state government. How much did the state government receive for 100 rupees worth of minerals? It turns out it received less than 5. We lost 95, as did all future generations of Goa. Now let's think about what this means. The extractor is receiving something worth 100 for just 5, over and top of which he's anyway getting a normal profit of 10. So anybody with this kind of a transaction will immediately go and try to extract as much of the minerals as possible and disappear before the public find out what's happening. Now think about the incentives of the state government. The state government receives 5 for the current volume of extraction. So the politicians tells the voters, let's double extraction and we'll get 10. Since this is royalty and we treat it as income, we'll spend it. You'll get higher subsidies, lower taxes, or we may construct some statues or various other ways we can spend the money. And voters are quite happy to support this. The result is the entire 100 of minerals which we inherited has been sold for a pittance, and even that pittance has been completely consumed, leaving 0 for our future generations. So what is to be done? We've come out with 5 simple principles which explain what we think should happen. Principle 1, natural resources including minerals are a shared inheritance where the state is a trustee on behalf of the people and especially future generations. Principle 2, since we have inherited the minerals, we must make sure our children inherit either the minerals or its full value. Therefore, principle 3, if we decide to extract and sell our minerals, then we must ensure zero loss. If the minerals are worth 100, we must get 100. Principle 4, whatever we receive for selling our minerals, we must save for our children. We are recommending a future generations fund, basically like a large mutual fund which is invested in index tracking, in a global portfolio of index tracking funds. And that gives us the best possible kind of return. And principle 5, we own the minerals, we own the fund created from the minerals, we own the income from that fund. Distribute that income equally to everybody in the state of Goa as a citizen's dividend, a right of ownership. We believe that this can actually transform the way mining happens, because the citizen's dividend is designed to connect the citizen to their wealth, both in the form of the financial wealth as well as the mineral wealth still in the ground. The zero loss is intended to reduce the loss of 95 down to zero, so that the value of the mineral is actually captured by the state as our trustee. And the principle of saving everything in the future generations fund is really intended to make sure that the state doesn't go out and actively exploit the minerals and spend the entire 100 as it feels like, but it actually gets saved in real income earning assets for our children and for future generations. And of course, the money invested is not going anywhere. It's still within the Indian economy. Now you can think about this from the perspective of somebody in the city of Panjim who's really not too bothered about mining. Yes, there are some environmental problems or human rights problems, but we can do better. But minerals are needed, and we must extract some, and some must come from Goa. From that perspective, our proposal is a proposal to continue extraction, but do it in a way that's sensible, rational, and benefits everybody, as well as takes care of our children and future generations. And once we agree that minerals are an inheritance, then surely the forests on top of the minerals are also a shared inheritance, as well as any kind of ability to get water from the filtration process, because laterite iron ore is really like a big sponge and holds water and filters it. These kinds of assets are also inheritances which we are depleting as we are extracting and selling off our mineral wealth. Now let's look at the climate concern from this lens. If you look at climate, what's happening fundamentally is that we have inherited a low carbon atmosphere, and through fossil fuels and some other activities, we are making it a high carbon atmosphere, with the result that global temperatures are going to rise and weather is going to become increasingly unpredictable, and with the result that parts of the planet will become uninhabitable, catastrophes will increase in frequency and severity, and there are some possibilities that we might tip the ocean into an uncontrollable state. So if you look at climate from this perspective, now let's look at what are the kinds of, let's look at the most important or the most supported economic proposal for dealing with climate, which is the proposal to impose a carbon charge and take the proceeds from that carbon charge and pay it out as a dividend. Now the logic is somewhat similar to what we are proposing, but with a difference. Now if you think about a climate charge plus a dividend, now clearly the poor or the vast majority of people are going to be consuming lower than the average, which average is increased tremendously by the rich. So in terms of what they pay by way of this carbon charge, they receive back a larger amount by way of the dividend. So there will be support for increasing the carbon charge over time. And the idea then being that consumption of these fossil fuels will reduce automatically in response. But there's a problem. The carbon charge is being looked at as being imposed at the point of consumption. But think of a country which has a large oil reserve like Saudi Arabia or maybe even Guyana. Now, from their perspective, any kind of a carbon charge basically reduces the value of their oil in the ground. And if the carbon charge is going to keep increasing each year, the value of their oil is going to keep decreasing. So the logical response from the point of view of somebody who owns large oil reserves is to take it out as quickly as possible and sell it before they become valueless. This unfortunate paradox is called Sin's green paradox. And it's an important aspect of this whole climate challenge. The other part of which needs to be considered when we think of the carbon charge and dividend is that carbon dioxide emissions are a long-lived pollutant. It will last in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. But if we pay out the proceeds today as a dividend to the current generation, they will simply spend it as income, which means future generations will inherit a worse climate with a higher carbon level, but no compensating asset. We are really going to be cheating our future generations. So if we think about, and another aspect of thinking of climate is that if we say that we want to have a target of, say, 2 degrees centigrade, then I calculated a couple of months ago, this basically implies that each person on the planet can emit by 2050 a further 4.6 tons of carbon dioxide each year from now to 2050. It's an absolute amount. It's a stock. It's not a renewable resource. And we have to think about, about our allocation of this limited capacity to emit carbon. And how do we think about that? If we think about the carbon emission space as also a shared inheritance, then surely everybody on the planet has a basic right to a minimum standard of living and the carbon emissions that comes with that. That clearly must get a very high priority. Also, a very high priority of the remaining carbon budget must go towards the energy transition. So by 2050, we have an economy that does not emit any carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases. That will require investment, and those investments will also require a certain carbon dioxide emission. So if these are the first two priorities of the use of our remaining carbon budget, then clearly we must think very hard about whether there is going to be anything left over for the other many frivolous uses we have today, holidays, private jets, and a whole variety of other things. So I want to end by this fundamental idea of intergenerational equity is essential to be followed, because what happens is, if you think about three sort of political groups, you have the future generations who have a right to the capital, the land or the gold or the minerals, whereas we, the current generation, only have a right to the income from that, and which we have to divide between the rich and the poor. But because future generations have no power, it's easier for the rich and the poor to get together and say, let's take over the minerals, let's take over the carbon space and consume it today. And if we continue to do that, this will inevitably lead to destruction of civilization, because it is fundamentally unsustainable. So unless we make the intergenerational equity principle foundational for civilization, put future generations ahead of the present generation, and make it part of our morals, our religion, our ethics, and our laws, we will inevitably not be able to solve either the resource curse or the climate crisis.